Firstly, let's recap. In the previous session, we understood about lists, we understood about how to prepare the data and render the list. Then we also have seen about keys, where we can add a unique key, and also about the key attribute. So we have built a user list application in this manner in the previous session. Coming to today's session, so in the components, there's another way to build React components, which is class component. We'll understand about that. So then we'll see about events, we'll see how to handle the events in React, and finally, we'll learn about state. We'll see how to set the state. To set the code program for today's session, you need to run this command. The necessary resources will be downloaded. Then run the npm install command so that all the dependencies will get installed. So now, let's start today's session. So when it comes to components, there are two ways to write the React components. One way is functional components, another way is class components. Okay, so let's understand each of these. Coming to the functional components. So the functional components are nothing but the components that we have written so far. Okay, so we have written an arrow function which has written a JSX element, right? So using a JavaScript function, we are returning a JSX element. So such JavaScript function is a functional component. Okay, clear? So the component, which is nothing but a function which returns a JSX element, is a functional component. Okay, so to the functional component, we pass the data as props. So using that props, so it will appropriately return a JSX element which we will render, right? That is a functional component. So there you can see an example of a welcome component there. Okay. So there you can see it's returning a JSX element. It's an arrow function which is returning a JSX element. Finally, in the app.js file, we are rendering the welcome component, right? And finally, you can see the result there. Okay, so let's have a look at this. So here in the code playground, so there's a welcome directory within which there's an index.js file. So here you can see the welcome component, right? So which is nothing but an arrow function which is returning a JSX element, right? So this is actually a functional component, okay? Because we are making use of the JavaScript function and we are returning a JSX element which is later on rendered in the app.js file, right? Clear? So we understood this, right? Okay. So you can actually run npm start, okay, and have a look at the output. So the server is starting, right? Let's have a look at it. So there you can see we have hello user, right? So we understood about the functional components, right? Okay. Another way of building React components is class component, where we are going to make use of the JavaScript classes. So we are going to build React components using JavaScript classes. Such React components are called as class components. So let's understand the syntax here. Okay. So to define a particular class as a class component, we need to extend that class to the component class. So in the React module, so there is a component class. You can see the welcome component, right? So which is nothing but an arrow function which is returning a JSX element, right? So this is actually a functional component, okay? Because we are making use of the JavaScript function and we are returning a JSX element which is later on rendered in the app.js file, right? Clear? Then the class that we want to define as a class component will extend that class to the component class. Okay, there you can see we have my component is a class. We are extending it to the component class. So now my component is a class component. Okay, so that class is actually a class component. Okay, so to define a React class component, we need to extend the component class. Okay, here one point to note is the component name should be in Pascal case. That is the first, so if there are separate words, the first word, the first alphabet of the word should be in capital. There you can see in my M is capital and component C is capital. So it should be in Pascal case. Okay, clear? So you understood the syntax. So to define a React class component, we need to extend this as with the component class. Firstly, we are importing it and then we are extending it with the component class. Okay. So here, when we are doing extending, okay, so this extends keyword basically inherits the methods and the properties present in the component class. So component class is present in the React module. So in that there are few methods, few properties that are defined. So those will get inherited when you extend. So with this, the my component will become a class component. Okay, clear? So you understood this, right? Okay, so here as we understood there are various methods like render, component ID, mount, which are present in the component class, and once you extend they'll get inherited into the my component. So firstly, let's understand about the render method. Okay, it's used to return a JSX element. So the JSX element returned by the render component will be actually finally being rendered. Okay, clear? So the render method has to return a JSX element that needs to be rendered. Okay, so in the class component, we'll have a render method. So this render method has to return a JSX element that we need to finally render. Okay, so just like how in functional components, the function will be returning a JSX element, right? Similarly, in the class component, so the render method has to return the JSX element that needs to be rendered. Okay, Clear? So let's apply this to our welcome component and try to build. Okay. So let's create a welcome class component. Now we are creating a welcome class component. So firstly, we'll write class welcome. Okay. It has to extend the component class. So we are importing the component class and we are extending it. Okay. So then, as we understood, the render method should return the JSX element that needs to be displayed on the UI. Okay, so here we have the render method, so within which we are returning a particular JSX element, a heading element. Okay, so which we are able to see finally in the output. Okay, clear? So shall we try this out? Okay. So here you can see, right, in the index.js, we have actually a functional component, right? So here we are making use of an arrow functioning and we are returning a JSX element. So this is a functional component. Now let's create a welcome class component. Okay, so let's do that. So for that, we'll write class. We are going to make use of the JavaScript classes. So class. So the class name is say welcome. Okay, so as we understood, to define a class as a class component, you need to extend the component class. So firstly, we need to import that. Okay, so import, we are going to import the component class from React. Okay, so we are importing it. So the next thing is, so we'll write class welcome, which has to extend and the component class. Okay, so with this, now the welcome component that we have written will actually become the class component. Okay, so as we are extending the component class, so it will be inheriting a lot of methods and properties present in the component class, one of which is the render method. So let's write render. Okay, so here the render method has to return the JSX element that needs to be displayed on the UI. Okay, so here in our welcome component case, so we want to return a particular JSX element, say a heading. Okay, say hello user, in this manner. Okay, so here we are already exporting the welcome component, right? So this is done. And coming to the app.js, so in the app.js, we are importing it. It's one and the same. So this is a, whether it's a class component or whether it's a functional component. So we are going to directly import that. And here in the app, we are going to appropriately render that particular welcome element. Okay. So here you can see we have React. So here it's actually React. So that's the reason it failed to compile. So we have updated that and you can see now it has been compiled successfully. Now let's have a look at the output. Okay. So here you can see, let me just refresh. There you can see we have hello user as the output. Okay, clear? So we are done implementing this, right? So the next step is, let's see about how to pass the props to a class component. It's just same as passing props to a functional component. Just like how we write HTML attributes to HTML tag. Similarly, for the component, so we write the prop name equal to and we'll provide the value. So it's as simple as that. Just like how we have passed props in case of functional components, similarly, we pass props to the class components. So there you can see name equal to Rahul. So name is a prop that we want to pass and the corresponding value is Rahul. Now let's understand how to access these props in the class component. So in case of the functional component, so the props will be passed as a parameter to the function, right? And then from there, we are able to do the object destructuring and access the prop, right? So whereas in case of the class component, so the props will be assigned to this dot props variable. Okay, so we can access the props using this dot props. Okay, there you can see this dot props. We are doing object destruction and from that we got the name and finally we are embedding that name into the JSX element. Okay, clear? So let's try this out. So when it comes to passing the props, as we understood, so just like how we pass props for the functional components, we provide the prop name equal to and we'll provide the value. So let's say Pranita. Okay, I've provided this name. Okay, so now let's access this prop. Okay, so now in the welcome component, which is a class component, to access the props, so the props will be present in this dot props variable. So using this, we can access the props. So constant, so we want name. So using object destructuring, we are accessing the name. Okay, and finally, we want to embed that into the JSX element. So let's write name in this manner. Okay, so we are done with this. And there you can see we got compiled successfully. Let's have a look at the output. Okay. So here you can see we have hello Pranita, right? So we got our result. Okay. So we understood about how to pass the props to a class component and also about how to access the props in the class component, right? So how do we access it? Using this dot props, right? Okay. So we understood about the class component, right? So now using this, let's build a counter app. Okay, so there you can see the application. So we have a counter application. So with increase, if you click on increase, so the counter has to increase. And if you click on decrease, so the counter has to be decreasing. Okay, so that's the functionality that we want to implement. Okay, so let's understand the steps involved in building a counter application. The first step is building the static version in the React, the static version, the heading, the buttons, the text, all this, the count text. So building that static version in React is the first step. Then the second step is adding event listeners to the button. So we have increase button, we have decrease button, right? So we need to add event listeners to these buttons. That is the second step. And finally, so based on the user action, that is clicking on these buttons, so the count has to appropriately be updated. If he clicks on the increase, so the count has to be increased by 1. If he clicks on decrease, so the count has to be decreased by 1. So appropriately we need to update the count. That is the final step. Okay, so these are the steps involved. Let's start with the step 1, which is building a static version in React. So let's first build a static version in React. Okay, so let's write the components related to it. Okay, as we understood, we generally organize the components in the source folder. So there you can see we have already provided the components directory and the counter directory to you. So within which we have the index.js and index.css files. Okay, so now in the index.js file, we'll start writing our counter component. Okay, so here we are going to make use of the class component. Okay, let's create the counter component using a class component. This is one way, right? We can either do it using functional or class. Let's make use of the class component way. Okay, so firstly we are writing class counter. So to define a class as a class component, we need to extend it with the component class. So extends component. Okay, so there you can see we are importing the component and we are finally extending it. Okay, so then within the counter, as we understood, there is a render method which will return the JSX element that needs to be rendered. Okay, so we have written the rendered method. This is all written in the index.js file. Okay, so next, what we have to do, we are building the static version, right? So that is the UI part of it. So where we need a container in which we'll be having the counter heading, and also below that we need the paragraph element where we'll mention the count 0, 1, 2, 3, that count text. Okay, we need a paragraph element for that. There you can see we have that heading and the paragraph. Okay, and also we'll add the buttons. Okay, so the increase and the decrease buttons, we need to add those. So let's add those buttons, and then along with that we have appropriately specified the class names. Okay, these classes are already available for you in the index.css file. So once you import index.css file, there you can see import./index.css. So all these class names you can make use of in the index.js file. Okay, so with this, the counter class component, we are done with it. Okay, writing the static version. So then we'll export this. Okay, so we are exporting. This is the only component present in this file. So we'll do the default export. So export default counter at the end. Okay, so with this, the counter component has been exported. So we can import that in the app.js file. There you can see. So we are importing it, and then in the app, we can directly render the counter. Okay, the counter component, and there you can see this is the final output that you will get. Okay, so shall we do these steps? Okay, let's step by step do all of these. Okay, so the first step is building the static version of the counter application. Okay, so let's do that. So as you can see, right, in the source directory, we have a components directory. So within the components, there is a counter directory. So in this, we have index.js and index.css files. Okay, so in the index.js, so we'll start creating our counter component. Okay, so as we understood, we are going to make use of the class, JavaScript classes to create the component. Okay, so here we are going to create a class component. So firstly, we'll write class, and the component name is counter. So here we have to use Pascal case. We have single word, so we have written counter. So for this class to be a class component, we need to extend the component class, right? So firstly, we need to import the component from React. Okay, we are done importing. So we need to extend this counter with the component class, right? So extends component. Okay, so with this, now this counter is actually a class component. So within this, we'll have the render method. So we'll write the render method. So this render method has to return the JSX element that needs to be rendered, right? So return. So now let's return the JSX element. Okay, so for that, let's start writing the JSX element. So firstly, we need a container. So within the container, we will have a heading element. Okay, say counter is the text. Okay, below that, we want to maintain the count 0, 1, 2, 3, that count text. Okay, so initially it will be 0. So let's write 0. Okay, so and also we want to add some buttons. Okay, so we want to add increase button and the decrease button. So let's write the buttons increase. And then another button is decrease. Okay. So this is all the HTML part that you're already familiar with. So let's enclose these buttons within a div element. Okay. In this manner. Okay. So there you can see we have a container, right? Within the container, we have a heading counter. Then there is the count text. So then we have the button. So the increase and decrease. Okay, so these are present. So there's some styling that we want to apply for this. Okay, so that classes corresponding to the styling are already available in the index.css file. So we can directly import the index.css file and specify the class names. So to import the CSS file, so we have to write import ./index.css. Okay, so then we can make use of the class names present in the index.css file. So there you can see initially we have container. This is the styling that we want to apply for this container. So class name equal to that container. Okay, so then you can see there's some styling that we want to apply for the heading. So let's apply that here. So this is the styling for the heading. So then for the count text, this is the styling, the class name that we want to apply. So let's apply that. So you can just directly refer to that, and just by looking at the class name itself, it will be clearly evident and about where we need to apply. And then coming to the button styling, here you can see we have button. So here we can specify here the class name as button, and then even here the class name is button. Okay, so with this we are done with adding a container, heading, count, and the increase and decrease buttons. Okay, and then we are returning this JSX element, right? So with this we are done writing the static version of the counter application. So this is the class component, right? So firstly, let's export this component. So this is the only component present in this file, so we can make use of the default export. So export default, and then so the component is counter. So we are done exporting. So now let's import this into the app.js file. Okay, so import counter from ./components/counter. Okay, so here you can just specify /counter. As we previously understood, by default when you specify /counter, if it's a folder path, then the index file present in that folder will be considered. Okay, now let's make use of this here. So you can see here we want to specify the counter. So we want to render the counter, so that's the reason we are returning the counter. So now you can check we are done writing all the code. So even the compilation is successful. So now let's look at the output. Okay, so here you can see the output there. We have the counter heading, there is count text, and there's increase and decrease buttons appropriately, right? Okay. So we are done building the static version, right? So the static version is done, and we can see this output, right? Okay, now let's proceed to the next step, which is adding the event listeners to the buttons. So we have the increase and the decrease buttons, right? So we need to add the event listeners for these buttons. Let's see how to add the event listeners. Okay, so adding event listeners in JSX is very similar to adding the inline events in HTML. So previously when we had to add events for the HTML elements, so we have written on click equal to the whatever event that we want to add, that event equal to, and we have specified the event listener, right? Similarly, in case of the JSX element, we'll specify the event which is on click equal to, and we have to specify the event listener, which is say this dot on increment. Okay, so we have to since we are referring to a particular variable, so we have to enclose it within the curly braces. Okay, so this is the syntax. Okay, clear? So if you observe, there is just slight modification. In case of the HTML, we have written on click with the C small, whereas in case of the JSX, here in the on click, the C is in capital letter, right? So just with a slight modification in the syntax, it's almost the same. So on click, same, here we have on click with the C capital, on blur with the B capital, on change with the C capital. It's very similar, okay, to the one that we write in the HTML. Okay, so here you can see in case of HTML we write on click equal to on increment, whereas here in case of JSX we write on click equal to and then this dot on increment. Okay, so here one point to note. Okay, so here we just need to specify the event listener. We shouldn't be calling that. Okay, so we shouldn't be calling that function. We just need to specify the event listener. There you can see we have just written this dot on increment. We haven't specified the parenthesis, so we shouldn't be calling the function. We just need to specify the event listener. Okay, clear? So we are done with this, right? So firstly, let's write the on increment, right? So there you can see on increment equal to, we have written an arrow function. So where we have the console log of an increment click. So generally when it comes to event listeners, you need to define them as arrow functions, right? It's important that you write it as arrow functions only. So on increment equal to, we have an arrow function. Then finally coming here, so we have on click equal to, within the curly braces, we have mentioned this dot on increment. Okay, so with this, we have appropriately created an event listener for the increase button. Okay, so now when you click on increase button, so in the console, you'll be able to see increment clicked in this manner. Okay, so let's try this out. Okay, so here, now coming to the counter component. So here for this increase button, so we want to actually add an event listener. Okay, so when it comes to JSX, it's very similar to adding inline events in HTML. So we have to write on, whereas here the C will be capital, so on click equal to, and then we have to specify the event listener. So for that, we'll make use of the curly braces. Since we are referring to a particular function, we'll write this dot and we'll specify the function, which is say on increment. Okay, now let's write the on increment function. Okay, so when it comes to the event listeners, we would prefer to use arrow functions. Okay, so on increment equal to an arrow function. So this is the event listener for the increment button. So let's just add some console log statement. So in the console log statement, so let's just say increment increase button clicked. Okay, in this manner. Clear? And then we have specified that here as this dot on increment. Okay, so let's have a look at this output. Okay, so here we are. So let's inspect the element. Let's have a look at the console. So now I click on the increase button and there you can see increase button click. You can click it again and you can see the number is changing, right? So this increase button clicked output you're able to see. Okay, so basically what happened here? So this we have assigned this event listener. So whenever we are clicking on this increase button, right? So on this increase button, appropriately this method is being called and the console log statement is being executed, right? Okay, so we are done adding the event listener to the increase button. Okay, the next step would be once the button is being clicked, the count has to be updated appropriately, right? So let's update the count on the button click, right? So currently there is 0. Now we want to update it to 1. Similarly, if it is 1, then again on increase, it has to be updated to 2, right? So appropriately, it has to be updated. Okay, so let's see how to update the count on the button click. So to understand this concept, first we need to understand about state. Okay, so first let's understand this and then we'll be able to easily achieve that. Okay, so state is actually a JavaScript object in which we store the components data that can change over the time. Like in our counter application, the count might change over the time, right? Based on the button clicks, right? So such type of data we'll be storing in the state object. So state is actually a JavaScript object. In that object, we'll be storing the data which can change over the time. Okay, so the state object is already present in the component class that we imported from the React module, right? So it will be already present in the component class. So when we extending it to our class component counter, so the state object will be available to us. Okay, so the advantage of making use of state object is, so whenever the state object is updated, then the render method will get called. Okay, so whenever we make a change to the state object, then the render method of the class component will be called. So then what will happen? The entire component will re-render, right? That's the advantage here. Okay, so when we click a button, so the count has changed, right? Since we are storing that in the state object, so since the state object is being updated, then the component will re-render, right? So appropriately the count will get updated. So that's the advantage of the state object. So that's the reason we store the data that can change over the time. So whenever the data changes, so since the state object will change, then the entire component will re-render. So we'll have the updated information, right? So the updated UI. Okay, that's the advantage of using the state. Okay, so let's have a look at our counter application. So in our counter application, the data that will change over the time is count, right? So let's maintain that in the state object. Okay, so there you can see in the class component counter, we have written state equal to, and we have written an object where count equal to count colon 0. Okay, so initially the count value is 0. Okay, so that is our state object. Now, so when it comes to rendering a JSX element, it should render based on the state object, right? So firstly, let's access the count from the state object and we'll return the JSX element based on that count variable. Okay, so with this, whenever the state object will get updated, so the entire JSX element will get, the component will be re-rendered. So with the updated count. Okay, clear? So you understood this step, right? Okay, so we are getting the count from the state object and appropriately based on the count. So we have created the JSX element and we are returning that. Okay. Clear? Let's try this out. So here, as we understood, so there is a state object that will be already present in the component class. So in the state object, we'll be storing the data that can change over the time. In case of our counter application, the data that changes over the time is the count value, right? So let's store that in the state object. So state equal to an object, so where the count is initially 0, right? So we have stored that. So now, based on the state object, we have to render this element, right? So the JSX element, here we have the count, right? So this count should be based on the state, right? So in the state we have count, so which might be updated. So based on this count itself, we have to display, right? Right? So what we have to do, we have to first access the state, right? So constant, then we have count, which is equal to this dot state. So by using this dot state, we can access the state object. So from that, we are getting the count. So based on the count, we are going to create the UI, right? There you can see. Clear? This step is done, right? So we have a state object in which we are maintaining the data that can change over the time. And based on the data present in the state object, we are creating the JSX element and we are returning that in the render method, right? Now, coming to updating the state, right? Now, let's say the count has changed. Now, how do we update the state? So for that, we can make use of the SetState method, okay? So when we want to update the state, we can make use of the SetState method. So the SetState method will take either a function or an object as an argument, okay? So we can either send a function or an object as an argument to update the state. Okay, so here you can see an example where we are passing a function as an argument. So this dot set state of, and we have a callback function. So for this function, the previous state will be sent as a parameter. Okay, so we have a state that will be sent as a parameter. So based on the previous state, we can appropriately update the state object. Okay, so we'll send that as a parameter, and within that callback function, we can update the state object. Okay, so there you can see an example. So when we are incrementing, we want to update the count, right? So for that, we write this dot set state of, and then we are passing a callback function as an argument. So there you can see. So within that, for that callback function, the previous state will be a parameter. There you can see. And then we can access the count from the previous state. So in the console log statement, you can see we are printing the previous state count. Okay, there you can see. Right, so whenever we click on increase button, so you can see the previous state value is 0. Okay, initially it's 0, right? So you'll get an output in this manner. Okay, let's try this out. Okay, so now we understood about maintaining the data in the state object, and then based on the state object, we are rendering the JSX element, right? We are returning the JSX element, right? Okay, now let's say we want to update the state, right? So on increment, we have to update the count, right? So let's see how to do that. Okay, so let's remove this for now. This is not necessary. Okay, so for that, we can make use of the SetState method. So this dot SetState of. So for this SetState, we can either pass a function or an object as an argument to update the state. So for now, let's send a function as an argument. So for this function, a callback function, we are sending as an argument. So for this, the previous state will be passed as a parameter. So we can make use of the previous state to update the state object. Okay, so now, firstly, let's just add a console log statement. So where, let's say, previous state count is, and then let's embed that. So previous state dot count. Okay, in this manner. Clear? So using the SetState method, we can actually update the state. Okay, so let's just first see a result for this. Now I'm clicking on increase. Right, there you can see the previous state count is 0. So again, I'm clicking on it. So previous state count is 0. So in this manner, basically this method is being executed, right? Okay, so actually what do we have to do? Okay, so basically we have to update the state object, right? So what we'll do is we'll return the state object, that the updated state object. Okay, so let's do that. So the count, so the count should be nothing but the previous state count plus 1. So let's do that. So previous state dot count plus 1. So with this, the count will get updated, right? And then we are sending that object. So now the state object will be updated with this new object. Okay, so we are returning this object. So in the SetState method, so we have a callback function which is returning the state object. Then what will the SetState do? So it will update the state object. So once there is a change in the state object, then what will happen? The render method will get called, right? So in the render method, we are accessing the count and appropriately we are displaying it in the UI. So now we'll get the updated count in the UI. Okay, that's the advantage here. Okay, let me save this and have a look at the UI. So here, let's come and then let me just clear this logs. Now I'll click on increase. So there you can see the count has been updated. So how is this happening? So because here, when we are clicking on increment, right? So on increment, the state object is being updated. So with the new count. So since the state object has changed, as we understood, automatically the render method will be called where we are accessing the updated count and then we are displaying the J6 element based on that count, right? So that's the reason the count has been appropriately updated. See, the things have become so simple, right? So we just update the state object, then automatically the entire UI will get updated. You need not worry about this entire J6 element. As we keep on building advanced applications, maintaining state and updating the state will actually be very useful. Okay, clear? So we understood this, right? So we have seen this output. Then in the on increment event listener, so we have updated the state object with the count with updated value. So since the state object was updated, so automatically the render method has been called. So and then we have the updated UI. So whenever we are clicking, so the count appropriately is being updated in the UI. Okay. So let's repeat the same steps for the decrement also. So when we click on decrease, firstly we need to add an event listener. So there you can see on click equal to this dot on decrement. So that on decrement is an event listener. So in that we are updating the state object. So this dot set state off. We are taking the previous state as a parameter. So then we are returning an object with the updated count. So previous state dot count minus 1. In case of decrement, the count has to be decreased, right? So previous state dot count minus 1. So we are returning that state object. So then appropriately the render method will again be called and the count will be appropriately updated. So you can see an output there. So if we click on increase, the counter is increasing. And now if we click on decrease, so the counter is appropriately decreasing and even going to negative values. Okay, let's try this out. So we are done with the increment part, right? Let's replicate the same thing for the decrement. So we have the decrease button. So for this, we need to add a event listener. So say this dot on decrement. So now let's add an event listener for this. So just like how we have on increment, similarly, we will have on decrement, okay, which is an arrow function. So then this dot set state of, to which we'll pass a callback function, which will take the previous state as a parameter. So then within this, we are going to just return and the updated object, right? So which is updated state object count, where we are going to take the previous state dot count minus 1. Okay, we are going to update it in this manner. Okay, so to the set state, we are providing an arrow function, right? So which is returning an object in this manner. Okay, clear? So the count is the previous state dot count minus 1. Oh. So we are returning that object as the result, right? So let's return it. So we'll properly return it as an object. So here we are returning an object. So we have to make use of the return variable, right? So done. So we have done writing the on decrement also, right? So let's test this now. So here, let's decrease. So you can see -1, -2, 3, now increase, so it's incrementing. And then if you decrease, so the counter has been appropriately updated, right? Clear? So we are done with this, right? So the steps are very, very simple. Okay. So here you can see, right? So in the index.js, we have created a class component, which is extending the component. So that's the reason here the counter is a class component. So in this, in the render method, firstly, we have designed the static version of the React, right? So then we added event listeners in this manner, right? Which is very similar to the inline HTML elements, adding inline HTML listeners. Okay. So then we understood this step. So then we have written the event listeners for that. So then we understood about the state in which we maintain the data that can change over the time. The data of the component which can change over the time, like the count, right? So appropriately, we were updating the state in the event listener and we were able to see the updated UI. Okay. So we have got this output, right? So there's one thing to note is there are functional components is one way to build React components. Class components is another way to build the React components. So when do we use functional components and when do we use class components? So basically, when we want to render the UI just based on the props, that is, there's some data. So based on the data, we have to render the UI. In such scenarios, you can make use of the functional components. But let's say the UI will be based both on the props and the state, like in our counter application. In such scenarios, we need to make use of the class components. Okay. So if the UI is based on the props and the state, then we'll make use of the class components. If it is just based on the props, that is just based on the data, then we can make use of the functional components. Okay. Clear? Whenever there's a requirement of a state, you need to use the class components. In case of other scenarios, you can make use of the functional components. Okay. So in today's session, we understood about class component. Then we understood about how to add event listeners and how to handle them in React. So we also understood about state.